It is a great privilege to worship together and to sing songs of praise together to our Lord and to meet together and study God's Word. This lectureship has been a tremendous influence on me. I remember different ones through the years and sitting in different places, and it's always been a great influence for good, and it certainly has influenced me in a lot of different ways. We truly do appreciate this lectureship, and we appreciate the 39th Street Church and the stand on truth that is taken through the years. Now, I made an agreement with the whippersnapper that's going to come after me that I could tease him, that he couldn't say anything, and he actually agreed with it. Can you believe that? I mean, that shows just how young and whippersnapper he is, but nonetheless, but I'm not going to really say too much about Hank. He's a good guy. Although I have a grandson that's older than him. But at any rate, after Jesus came into the city of Jerusalem, about a week before his death, we call it the triumphal entry to the city. Not long after that, he cast out the money changers out of the temple. And the Jews came to him, and they said to him, "Who gave you this authority?" Now, I don't know for sure, and probably it was a combination of different things that they were talking about, whether the authority to come into the city of Jerusalem like he did, or the authority to cast out the money changers. But they said that to tempt him. Just a few days later, we're talking about the last week of Jesus' life here on earth. And during that week, they asked them about the money and paying taxes to Caesar. And they were tempting him. And then they challenged him concerning the resurrection. The Sadducees specifically challenged him on that particular point. And then a man came to him. He is described as a lawyer and a scribe. And he asked Jesus, which is the great commandment of the law? Or which is the first and great commandment? Depends on the translation. Now, we know that questions are motivated by different reasons. Thankfully, some questions are motivated because we're seeking truth. We want to know the truth. Other questions are motivated because they're trying to set a trap. And then the questions are sometimes motivated to seek an answer that they want themselves, or to really get to what they're looking after and they're seeking. Now, Matthew recorded the fact that this lawyer scribe came to Jesus tempting him. That's the words that's used in Matthew 22 and verse 35. Now, tempting does not necessarily mean that he was trying to entice Jesus to do evil, or trying to entice Jesus to do something with wrong motives or evil motives. Sometimes it just simply means to test his knowledge. Now, we don't know fully what the questioner had in mind at the beginning, but we do know that the statement that Jesus made at the end, either he had a change of heart, which I prefer to think about, or he was sincere in the questions that he asked. And so we don't know everything about this particular man. We know that this was not the Pharisees or the Sadducees' motives, but it appears to be the lawyer's motive nonetheless. Now, Jesus' reply is in Mark 12, verses 29 through 31, and that'll be our text for this evening. And so please open your Bibles to that particular text. Mark chapter 12, verses 29 through 31. And Jesus answered him, the first commandment, O hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. And the second is like, namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these. So Jesus' reply then is really where we want to study. Now our purpose is to examine our Lord's answer to this scribe lawyer, and to notice how his teaching on love is distinctive. Now, in order to accomplish this, we're going to look at basically 3 points. We're going to look at first a definition of love, and we're going to look at the word that's used in the text for that definition. Then we're going to look at the priority of love, and then last we're going to look at the teaching that Jesus had on love in this particular text. So let's begin then with the definition of love. Now, in order to understand Jesus' answer, I don't know how we could ever understand it without understanding the word that he used with reference to love. Now, all of us surely know that love is not love. Now, contrary to the billboards that you've seen, contrary to the stickers you've seen on cars, contrary to signs you see in different people's yards that promote this idea or this concept of love is love, it just simply is not true. And brethren, I think anybody that's reasonable know that it's not true. Now, we use love in different ways. Now, there are at least 4 different types of love. Now, the first type of love is, well, here's the picture that I have in my mind. And I saw this on some type of movie or television show 20 years ago or something like that. And this guy's up on the framework of a building. He's building this skyscraper. He's up there. He's hanging on with dear life. And he sees this beautiful young lady walk across the way there. And he goes, whoa, I love that babe. Well, let's get real here. You know, first of all, I mean, that's a pretty shallow view of love. Just because you see a beautiful young lady. I mean, that's really a pretty shallow, but that's what the people of the world think about. That's the kind of love that they think about. But then we also have kinship or family type love. And I think back, you know, and I've used to do a lot of genealogy, and once in a while I'll get involved in it again and do those kind of things. And it's always amazing. You have this automatic, this kinship affection for people you don't even know. I mean, you just know that they had the same name or that they were related to you in some way. And yet you feel that kinship with them. And that's one kind of love. Or maybe we could do it like this. You remember having an Aunt Martha? Well, I didn't have a truly, quote, Aunt Martha, but I remember having some aunts, and they were, well, quite frankly, some of them were just cranks. I mean, they were cranky old women. And in my mind at that time, of course, they would have been quite a bit younger than I am at this present time, but nonetheless, I remember them and getting after us and doing all kinds of different things and just being cranky. But you know, I still remember loving them too, because they were my dad's sisters. And so there was that automatic, and again, I don't know if that's the best word to use, but nonetheless, it is an affection that we had because we were kin. But then there's also brotherly love, or we would probably better say it with friendship. And you know how life goes. We have friends that are friends for a short time, and then we have friends that are friends for quite a long time. Brother Avis Watson and I were talking, And we remember clear back when he had that Avis Booth Company and having a part in that, and we became friends, very dear at that particular time, and our friendship has continued. Well, we have friends like that. We recognize those friends. But the word that Jesus used in this particular text is the word agape. Now, the word agape, I think most of us have heard of that particular word, but the word agape is that greatest love that you could have. And there are some characteristics of agape. And from what I've read and different things that I've studied, there are at least 5 different, at least main characteristics of agape love. The first characteristics of agape love is it's sacrificial in nature. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. That shows that sacrificial interest in all of mankind. Well, that's that kind of love that a husband should have for his wife. I mean, if you're a man and you have a wife, are you willing to take a bullet for her? Well, if you're not much of a man. That's just plain and simple. We have to be willing to protect our wives. And we have to be willing to sacrifice ourselves for our wives. That's that sacrificial love aspect of it. But another aspect of this love is that it always seeks the highest good for others. Now, what do I mean by that? Have you ever had a Bible study with somebody? I'm talking about a private Bible study. And you're looking at that person and you're trying to lead them to Christ. And what do you want most from them? Convince them of baptism? I hope not. I hope you're really wanting and desiring the highest good for them, their salvation. And so sometimes we have to look at our methods and the way we do things in order to accomplish what we're really trying to accomplish, the highest good for them. Now, they can be argumentative. And if you've had Bible studies like I've had some that are pretty argumentative. In fact, I had one lady one time just flat told me that she knew more about it than I did. Okay. I thought to myself, well, just how do you know that? I mean, you don't know me. But nonetheless, that's what she told me at the very beginning. But you still have to learn to love them. You have to learn to desire their highest good. And there's nothing higher as far as good is concerned than them becoming a member of the Lord's church. Now that includes baptism, so don't take me wrong on that. But nonetheless, we're looking for their highest good. Another characteristic, or a third characteristic of agape love, it involves an emotion. And I don't know how we could separate emotions from love, but it involves an emotion, but it's more than an emotion. And so when we're talking about agape love, we've got to include this concept of emotion. Do you love the world the way that God loves the world? Do you realize that the majority of the world is going to be lost? Does that not move you? Does that not build emotions within you? Does that not build an earnest desire for their highest good? I remember one day while in Kiev, Ukraine. Now, Kiev had some of the longest escalators I've ever seen in my life. And this particular station that I would go to go to school, I would go to that station and literally you'd be on this escalator for, 4 or 5, maybe even 10 minutes. I mean, you'd just be riding up that thing and riding and riding. You think you're never going to get to the end. And in fact, it's so long that you can't see the top from the bottom or the bottom from the top. That's how long this escalator is. And one day I'm on the way to school, and it just happened to be the opposite time that most people are traveling, the direction that I was traveling. I was going up the escalator when most people were going down the escalator. And I thought to myself, they're descending into hell. And they don't even know it. And I couldn't help myself, but I actually broke down. Because most people are lost. Agape love is an emotion. But it's more than an emotion. It's a determination. There's your fourth characteristic of agape love. You see, it is something that we determine to do. Yeah. You know, all of us recognize that. I mean, you ladies, are there things that your husband does that kind of just ruffles your feathers? Well, yeah, of course. You know, but what do? You determine to love him anyway, don't you? Well, of course you do. And it works the other way around, and we know that. But doesn't it work with our kids the same way? You see, agape love is a determination. We're going to love that person no matter what they do. That's why that someone that loves the Lord and that loves the work that He does, and no matter what happens, they continue to do that work. They don't quit. Like it was mentioned earlier about Jeremiah. I mean, I think about all the different things that happened to Jeremiah. But you know, he didn't quit. He just kept going. And that's what we have to do. And we need to learn from him. And then the fifth characteristic of agape love is that it's not dependent upon the recipient. And aren't we glad? I mean, if that love was dependent upon the recipient, could you imagine what would have happened to the world years ago? No, God so loved the world. He sent His own Son. And He did not send the Son to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. He sent His Son. And when you look at Isaiah 53 and the different things that are said about the Lord and the things that the Lord did, but the Father looked upon the Lord. And He was satisfied with that sacrifice the Lord made. But can you imagine being a father looking upon your son, knowing that the majority of the world would forsake him? You talking about a determined action. God determined to love this world. And we must be determined to do the same. And so those five distinctions then are made of this agape love. And that's the word that Jesus used when He said, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength." It was this word agape. It is all of those things. Are we willing to sacrifice for our God? Are we willing to do that which is against our own will, against our own nature, in order to serve our God? Are we just simply an emotion, or do we have that determined action? Are we then ones that are like God in that we're going to preach and teach and do the work that we do because God loved the world, and we're going to imitate that love that God has for us? But that love is distinctive. You think about it for a second, about the world's view of love. Anybody ever heard the word tolerance? Boy, I mean, you can't hardly read the news. You can't hardly pick up the paper. You can't hardly hear the television set or the radio without somebody talking about tolerance. That's the world's view of love. Well, if you really love them, you'll tolerate them, or you'll make allowances for them, or you'll be permissive of those. I remember a student one time in preaching school, and I don't remember exactly all the details about it, but he said, "Chuck, you don't love me." And he was really wanting to get out of some work or do something that he didn't really want to do. And he says, "You don't love me because you won't permit me to do these things." And I said, "No, It's really the other way around. It's because I love you and want you to grow that I require these things. But the world's view of love is tolerance or allowance. The world's view of love is acceptance. It's to show agreement when there is no agreement, or to show approval when they ought not be shown approval. Here's how I think about this. You ever known anybody that, well, a lot of folks are like this, that they're always the exception to the rule? You ever known anybody like that? I think about this lady that I knew years ago. She was a bank teller. And I found out she was a member of the church, and she said, well, don't you think it would be all right for me to skip the assembly, because after all, Sunday's the only day I have to sleep in. Well, I must have made her feel guilty, because next thing I know, she transferred out of there and transferred herself to another facility, and so I never saw her after that. But isn't that pretty typical? Where people think they're always the exception to the rule? That's the world's view of these things. But when we make all the exceptions, it's a little bit like lowering the flag when a president dies. Nowadays, we lower the flag for just about everybody, and then it becomes no meaning at all, rather than special occasions. And when we make exceptions for every rule, then the rule means nothing. But another view of the world's love is alliance. Now, what I had in mind was, you remember the days of the judges? When everybody did that which was right in their own eyes. And they decided that God wasn't good enough to be their king, that they wanted to be like the other nations, and so they aligned themselves with the other nations. Well, hasn't that happened to the church as well? Where there are congregations of the Lord's church that have aligned themselves with the denominational world. Brethren, I remember hearing an old preacher years ago, and he has since passed from this life and gone on to his reward. But he said, I came out of a denomination, I'm not going to return to one. Well, brethren, I feel the same exact way. I came out of a denomination, I'm not going to return to one. I'm not going to align myself with the people of the world. And so the world's definition of love is tolerance, it is acceptance, and it is alliance. But you know what God's view of love is? God's view of love is compliance. 2 verses. One's already been quoted today. And you probably already know the verses that I'm going to refer to. You ever heard of John 14:15? If you love me, keep my commandments. Doesn't that show compliance to the will of God? That's God's view of love. Or flip the numbers around. 15 verse 14. Ye are my friends if you do whatsoever I've commanded you. You see, that's God's view of love. And we need to have that same view. We need to comply with God's love, and we need to comply with His regulations. We need to comply with His law. We need to comply with His gospel. After all, those things are not just simply something that is not to our benefit. It is every bit to our benefit. Well, then we get to the idea of priority of love. Remember the question the lawyer scribe asked was, which is the first commandment of all? Well, the lawyer, the scribe, had an idea. He understood at least one thing about it, that it was the first commandment. And so he understood the priority that we're talking about. Now, Matthew's account says, Master, which is the great commandment of the law? And Mark, of course, chose the idea of first commandment of the law. And two different words are used in this particular place, but when you look at the whole context, both words are used in both places. And the one word, we get our word something that's a prototype, from that particular word. Now, in English, prototype usually means the first, and we're talking about first in order. But in the original language, it didn't always mean first in order. Sometimes it meant first in importance or a foundational principle. And so this is the first commandment because it's foundational, it's important, it's the most important, it's preeminent thing that we need to have. Now the other word that's used, and again, both words are used in both texts. In Mark's account, he says, these are the greatest commandments, but the other word is the word mega. You ever heard of mega? I mean, sometimes we'll have mega box stores, things like that, and it's extremely big and it means great. Well, it meant the same thing in the original language, in the Koine Greek. And so it is that mega commandment. And what these are talking about is that everything stems back to this commandment, or these commandments. So Mark and Matthew both use both of those words. Now, but let's face the facts here. Priority of love is seen in the natural scheme of things. Is it not the case that people recognize that we have a greater responsibility of love to certain members or certain people than other people? I mean, people of the world know. I mean, I've talked to enough men to know that they need to have a greater love for their family. Now, usually they'll just include everybody in that family, but nonetheless, they know that they ought to have a greater love for their family than just the average person on the street. I remember talking to a man years ago, in fact, a gospel preacher, and he was a pacifist to the nth degree, I guess you would say. And I said, what would you do if somebody broke into your house and was ravishing your wife? He said, well, I couldn't do anything. And I said, well, you could cry across the room and say, honey, I love you. He got mad. He became very angry with it. But doesn't love demand that we love our wives more than we love the stranger who's broken into our house? And that we protect her? I think love demands such. Does that not show the priority of love? When a friend would do something in order to protect a friend, does that not show love? Or the soldier who's willing to lay down his life. Maybe he's thinking about his country, but I really seriously doubt that. I think he's probably thinking about his comrades in arms, those he's fighting with. Or he's thinking about his family at home, or his wife at home, or his parents at home. And he's willing to put his life on the line in order to protect his family. Does that not show priority? I mean, the reality is this, and I know that this is not going to be popular with everybody, but that's all right. I'm not trying to be popular. I'm just trying to make some common sense. But the reality is that those mamas on the enemy's side hurt just like our mamas do when their sons are killed. Our love for our families are deep. And whether that family is here in the United States, or in Africa, or in Europe, or wherever it is, we have those deep emotions and deep love that we have for our families, and those take priority over people we do not know. The priority of love in the first century was especially important as far as the world, or as far as the Israelite people were concerned. It represented in some ways the oneness of God as opposed to the heathenism or the affections of multiple gods. It corresponds to the preeminence of God as the source of godliness and all goodness and all life. In James 1 and verse 17, you remember the passage, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. And also Acts 17 and verse 25, neither is worship with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all. He giveth to all life and breath and all things. We live and move and have our being because of Him. That's verse 28 of the same chapter. We understand that God provides everything that we are. If God did not provide for us, you know what would happen to us? We would not be. That's what would happen. We would not exist. Love is the greatest expression, and love is the greatest experience. What greater love is there than the love that God shows for all of mankind? We love Him because He first loved us. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19. What nobler love is there than man's love for God? Love is the greatest because it cannot be exhausted, and there's always room for growth. Now let's go to our text and let's look at each of the verses that have been assigned. We'll look at verse 29, then 30, and then 31. And we divide then this text into three parts, and then we're going to make a few observations after the end of it. In verse 29, he said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." And that's a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. And to the Jewish mind, or to the Israelite mind, it's called the Shema. Now, it looks like Shema in English, but it's not Shema, it's Shema. It's spelled in English S-H-E-M-A, but it's pronounced Shema. And it's called the Shema because of the very first word that's used. It's hear, O Israel. And the word hear is Shema in the Hebrew language. And so that's why they called it the Shema. So it's Shema, O Israel. Now this was one of four passages that the Jews would write on their phylacteries. You remember they had leather bands and different leather coins and things like that they would write passages on. And this was one of four passages that they would use. And literally translated, that is from the Hebrew, it's Jehovah is Elohim, is one Jehovah. Or in modern English, it's Yahweh is Elohim, or our Elohim is one Yahweh. Now, if you're interested, because sometimes I enjoy word studies, and so I look at this and look at that source and all these kind of things. And sometimes people will come up and say, I really enjoy those word studies. And then I have others that come up and say, I wish you'd keep them out of there. I mean, who speaks Hebrew or who speaks Greek? Well, I understand both sides of it. I enjoy the word studies. And if you'd like to know about the reason why it's called Yahweh now rather than Jehovah as it was in King James, I'll explain it to you later if you're interested, okay? We'll just leave it like that for now. All right, so Jehovah our God, or Jehovah our Elohim, is one Jehovah. And this was a declaration. It was a declaration against polytheism, and against the multiple gods of the world. That's what polytheism is. And it's a declaration that God is absolutely God. That's really what that means. God is absolutely God. And it's a declaration of God's sole authority. You remember how Jesus answered the question that was given to him that we mentioned earlier? Who gave you this authority? And Jesus said, I'll answer that question if you'll answer this question. The baptism of John, whence was it? From heaven or of men? And that gave us an insight into authority. There's only two sources of authority. There's the authority from God, rightful authority, and then there's the authority of men. And that's not the rightful authority. And so God has that sole authority. And so it's a declaration of that authority. Then thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and I've got to get moving now. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now, most of the commentaries that I read, they just simply, I think some of them, well, I know one of them did, because it just almost was this direct. I'm not going to spend time with those different things because it just simply refers to the whole of man, period. Well, Jesus used 4 words, heart, soul, mind, and strength. If we're going to understand what Jesus said, don't you think we need to understand those 4 concepts? Now, admittedly, they bleed together, and they're always something that we could say, well, it's definitely this or definitely that, but there are still 4 concepts there. The heart, because he used the mind here, just the third one, then we don't believe it's the mind. In fact, it wouldn't make any sense. Mind, heart, mind, and strength, that doesn't make sense. He's talking about something else. And now the way we were taught in school is to think about it as the seat of the emotion. Now, dummy me, I was just a punk kid, even younger than the guy after me, when I went to school, and I thought, what do you mean by seat of emotion? He's talking about where the emotions come from. That's what we're talking about. Is our love for God something where the emotions or stems from the emotions? At least in part, it has to. The soul, well, the Watchtower witnesses, they want you to think that the word soul always means animate part of man. Well, it might mean animate part of man on occasions, and in fact, I'm quite confident that it does. But don't let false teachers define your terms. Let's face the facts here. And I know that I can call them rightfully false teachers. Why? Because they've made predictions of the future that did not come to pass. Isn't that Moses' definition of a false teacher? I remember sitting in school in 1975, and the day that the Watchtower witnesses had designated as the rapture or the coming of the Lord. And I remember that day thinking, well, I wonder if he's coming. And the day passed, and here it is. 1975, what is it? 2022? That's a long time ago. And it didn't come to pass. And they've actually predicted it since that time, and they had other predictions before that time. They're false teachers. Don't let them define your terms. The word soul can mean the same thing as a spirit. It's the inner part of man on occasions. It represents that idea. And I think that's how it's used here. You love God with your inner being. And then he said the mind. You love God with your mind, with the intellect. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. And I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the understanding also. 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 15. And then strength. The word strength in this case means energy or action. It's the strength that we display in trying to accomplish something. Now let's put it all together. People ought to love God more than with their emotions. They need to be It needs to come from their inner being. But people ought to love God more than just their inner being. It ought to be inconsistent and consistent with their thoughts, their mind. And people cannot worship God or love God merely with their thoughts or with their minds, but they ought to do so with their actions as well. And in fact, if it doesn't move to actions, it really didn't start where it should have started. I mean, it's all that are involved in it. God should be loved, and He should be the center of our affections. He should be the center of our lives. He should be the center of our thoughts, and He should be the center of our actions. And then the second commandment is, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The word neighbor simply means near, and we get our word, by the way, place, from the word that's used in that particular passage. And to the Jewish mind, the neighbor was nothing more than a fellow Jew. But because of Luke chapter 10, Jesus expanded the idea of neighbor to include all of mankind. And thus the Samaritan who helped the man on the road. Every person should love him or herself. Every person. Now I should put there should, because I've known people that don't love themselves. And you probably have met some too like that. And every person has a neighbor, and every person is a neighbor to someone. And every person is to love his or her neighbor as himself or as herself. Brethren, good listeners, listen to me. Good morals are based upon this principle. To love your neighbor as yourself means you're not going to lie to them. It means you're not going to cheat them. It means you're not going to kill them. It means you're not going to hate them. It means you're not going to cheat on them. It means you're not going to do all these other things because you love them. And the person who does those kind of things, it's because they do not love their neighbor. Now, the entirety of the old law, I'm talking about the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are centered on those two principles. The first 5 commandments are centered on, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. The last 5 principles are based upon, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. So the entirety of the law. But then let's jump ahead. Let's get to the New Testament. Name one commandment. Name one statement. Name one idea that doesn't go back to these 2 ideas. None of them. Every single one. You can't find one that doesn't go back to either thou shalt love the Lord thy God or thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now Jesus answered the inquiring lawyer, scribe, and it seems like he was, because of what he did, he clearly was in full agreement with that. And it appears that his thoughts were at least sincere to one degree or another. I don't know. When did the lawyer make that change? Maybe he was already sincere, but maybe it was Jesus answering his inquiry that the lawyer thought for a second and decided that, he's right, and I need to make a change. Well, whenever that lawyer made that change, we don't know. But I do know this. Jesus said concerning that lawyer, He said, you're not far from the kingdom. Well, I think there's a tremendous lesson for us. What about us? Do you hear the words of Jesus? Do you truly love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? And do you love your neighbor as yourself? Heaven awaits, but it awaits those that love God and that love their neighbor. Thank you.